Welcome to Podcast Answers, the show all about podcasting and answering your podcast questions. What we do is we help people grow their show, answering podcast questions along the way. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to be answering a question that someone had actually let me know of, and they wanted a question to answer. Why not use a free podcast host? There's so many podcast hosts out there, and a lot of them are paid, but there are some that are free. So we will be talking a little bit about why you should or should not use a free podcast host. But first, guys, if you can go subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/podcast answers. And the reason that I want you to do that is a lot of times the topics that we're talking about on our show are going to be topics that are visual in nature. And so an audio podcast, you may just not be getting everything that you need to be getting from that. So if you go over to youtube.com/@podcast answers, you can subscribe there and see all of our shows. We record live video for all of our shows. So without further ado, let's get into the topic today about podcasting and why you should or should not use a free podcast host. So this question was submitted by Ron, and Ron asked me, he said, hey, Andy, I see things like Anchor and, what was Anchor? I see things like Anchor and it's free. You're asking me to subscribe to a host that's going to cost me $10, $15, $20 a month. So what are the advantages of paying for a podcast host versus just getting the actual free host that is out there? So there are a few pros to things like Anchor. Well, formerly known as Anchor. Anchor is actually no more. It's podcast. It's Spotify Podcasters Studio. So it's a free host through Spotify now, but it's not the separate Anchor brand. But so the pro is it's free. You may not know if you like to podcast. You don't have to pay for it. So that's great. That's one of the pros to having a free host. Now, it also gives you the opportunity to see if you like podcasting. There's such thing as pod fade. A lot of people start a podcast and they don't end up continuing it because it's a lot of work. It's fun, but it's a lot of work. And so within 10 episodes, a lot of people are quitting their podcast because it's just a lot of work. They don't have the time for it they thought they did. It's maybe not as fun as they thought it was. So they do what's called pod fade. So having a free podcast host allows you to kind of test those waters out, see if podcasting is something that you're going to like. One of the cons to free podcast hosts, and there's many cons, is you get what you pay for. I always say, if it's free, you're going to get quality of free. And so what you get what you pay for. You're not paying anything for the podcast host. And that is going to be pretty evident with what you're getting. Another thing is, if it's free, you are the product, because they're most likely going to sell your email. They're going to sell you to sponsors. They may even put sponsors in your show without you getting the benefit of those sponsors being in there. So your listeners may have to actually sit through ads that you have no control over, you don't know what's in them, and you don't get that money off of those advertisers. Another bad thing about free podcast hosts are there are no stats, or the stats are really bad. So again, stats aren't everything. If you're just new to podcasting, stats help you know how many listeners you have, how many downloads you have. It helps you know the things that may help to know if your podcast is actually growing or if it's staying the same size. And with a free podcast host, you may not have the stats, the quality stats that you do from a paid stats. There's a paid services have to go through the IAB, or they don't have to, but they can choose to, which is a broadcast. It's a kind of a standard. And so there's a standard way of counting stats, and those hosts have to get certified that their numbers are compliant with the IAB stats. And that costs a lot of money for the podcast hosts to do, to say that their podcast stats are compliant and they're certified. And so free podcast hosts, you're not going to get that level of stats. You may not even get stats at all. You may not actually know how many people actually are listening to your podcast or not. So you don't know if you're growing or you're shrinking. You just don't know. Another bad thing about free podcast hosts is that they can disappear at any time. Because they're not getting money from you, they have to be making money somehow, or they're not going to stay around. There has to be some reason that their company is making, that they're getting money, because podcast hosting costs a lot of money to actually do the podcast, to actually host the media files. It's not cheap to do that. Ask any podcast hosts. And if they tell you something, they're going to tell you, no, it is, our monthly bill for our hosting is huge. And how they can do that is because, they're making money from you, but they're also taking on some liability of that. And so they're able to do that. But free podcast hosts don't have that luxury. They don't have the ability to say, we're making money. And so they can disappear anytime without even giving you any warning at all, or a little warning. They may say, at the end of the month, we're shutting down and you need to find a place to actually move your host or move your files to. That doesn't give you a lot of time to actually move your stuff to a new place. So what I would do is I would definitely recommend choosing a hosting company that has been around for a while. Podcast hosts in the last several years, there's been lots of new podcast hosts, places to put your files. And I'm not saying any of those newer ones are bad, but they just don't necessarily have a track record in podcast hosting. So I would pick a host that's been around for a while, that is going to stick around for a while, that's innovating, and that's able to keep up with what's going on in the podcast world. Pick a host that's been around for a while and one that's not free. Also, directories deprioritize free podcast hosts. So a directory like Apple Podcasts or the Podcast Index, they know that free hosts produce a lot of crap, produce a lot of shows that are just testing 1, 2, 3, knock, knock, knock. Is this thing on? That may have one episode, or may just say, I'm just talking about whatever because I can. So directories deprioritize those free podcast hosts. And a lot of times will take their podcast out of their directory altogether if they don't, haven't had an episode within the last 30 days or whatever. And you don't want that to happen to your podcast. You want your podcast to be found by everybody. You be able to get your word out there. You being able to get it produced and it out to the world. So you don't want those directories that are where people find your podcast at. You don't want them to take your podcast out of that listing. Also, the free podcast host just may not have the same level of features and functionalities as paid podcast hosts do. Lots of new things are happening in the community with the Podcasting 2.0 initiative, and free podcast hosts just don't have the same functionality. Like if you were to look at Anchor or any of the other free podcast hosts, there are a few, not just Anchor. And again, Anchor's not around anymore. It's rolled into Spotify. But if you take a look at that, they're going to offer you the basic thing. They're going to offer you a place to put your file. But they're not going to offer you some of the more advanced features. They're not going to offer you value for value where you can earn bits of Bitcoin in your podcast. They're not going to offer you the ability to be able to have a transcript. Free podcast hosts just are not worth what you're paying for, or you get what you pay for, so they're not worth it. You're not paying anything, and so it's not worth putting your podcast there if you're serious about podcasting. Now, if you're just doing it for to say test to see how you're testing, then great. Free podcast hosts are great for testing to see if you're actually going to like podcasting. But it takes a lot to move from that free podcast host to a paid host. You can do it, and it's not hard. It definitely is not hard. You can do it, but why go through the... If you think you're going to do this, and you do the podcasting thing, would you put yourself through starting somewhere free and then 2 months down the road moving to somewhere paid? It just is not worth it. So guys, you may ask how I know all of this information, and I'll tell you this.
How did you know all that?
I'll tell you how. Because I made a podcast.
Now that quote is from a movie. It's from actually a show, National Treasure. But I do know this stuff because I've been doing podcasting for a while. So I thought I'd throw that in there because I thought it was a fun little quote, and I think it's funny that podcasting is pretty prevalent in the society now. But with that being said, guys, I would not use a free podcast host if you're actually serious about podcasting. Now, guys, I want to do a feature here.
Now it's time for the Boostergram Corner. Boostergram Corner.
I don't know a thing about crypto.
So a reminder for you guys who may not have heard this show yet or don't remember, Boostergrams are something with the new Podcasting 2.0 that you can send small messages and bits of crypto, bits of Bitcoin with from your podcast app to the podcast host. And so we actually have a boostergram that was sent in to us, 100 sats, and that's from Aqualith. And Aqualith says, looking forward to your advanced content. So Aqualith, thanks for sending that boostergram in. And guys, if you want to be like Aqualith and send questions in, you can do it that way. That helps support the show as well as get your question read on the show. But also, if you don't have that boost button in your podcast app, you're going to need to get a better podcast app. You can go to podcastanswers.com/boost to find yourself a new podcast app that includes a boost button so that you can boost in messages to our show. If you're not into Bitcoin, that's fine. Not everybody is. You can also still support our show by going to podcastanswers.com/buymeacoffee, and that'll allow you to support the show and help us to get new hardware, try out new services so that we can bring that information to you. So again, podcastanswers.com/buymeacoffee or podcastanswers.com/boost, BOOST, if you want to get a new podcast app that has a boost button. Guys, we are not going to be around next week. We're not going to have a show next week because we are actually going to be, next 2 weeks because of spring break. So I know we're just starting this show, and usually I like to say get out there and keep producing lots of content because your fans will want it. But we're taking a break because we're doing spring break. So remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and the Podcast Answers podcast in any podcast app of your choice. So guys, with that, have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you when I get back from spring break.